Okay, so right back here, we're going to go ahead and start talking about the final gathering map parameters here and how useful they are to rendering out with final gathering. So let me collapse all of these other attribute areas over here, and I'm going to open up the final gathering map parameters here. So we don't really have a lot of parameters. However, these parameters are very, very important when working with final gathering. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's do an IPR very quickly here. Maybe this area right there. And I'm using way too many rays here, so I'm going to reduce these rays back down to 32 for preview purposes. I'm also going to go to Final Gathering Tracing here and take the Use Radius Quality Control off, so it uses just point interpolation, so it goes a little bit faster. Okay, so the first parameter here we have is a drop-down box for rebuild that says off, on, or freeze. The default is on. What this means is that final gathering is rebuilding every time we render out. If you notice, every time we make a change, it renders out. Now, if we're doing, say, moving our camera around, it needs to render out again. One important thing to know about final gathering is that it's view dependent. That is, the final gather rays are working with the camera right now. So whatever's inside the camera view and whatever objects are facing us are going to go ahead and have final gathering computed for them. Sides of objects that are facing away from the camera and are not visible to the camera, and areas of the scene that are outside of the camera's view are not going to have final gathering properly computed for it. So they may have some blotching left over from final gathering, but it's just going to be full of artifacts and the lighting is going to be completely useless to us. Okay? So it's very important to understand that principle about final gathering first. That unlike global illumination photons, which fill up the entire scene, even areas behind the camera, final gathering does not work that way. It's view dependent, it's camera dependent. It only works on whatever's in the view of the camera. Even if this object right here that I'm pointing at is in the view of the camera, it doesn't matter. The back side of it is not going to have final gathering computed for it. Final gather rays are just not going to reach it because they're not in the view of the camera. Now with that said, over here we have a primary final gather file field, a text field. We can actually create a final gather map the same way we did with a global illumination map earlier in the global illumination chapter of this tutorial. Okay, so we can actually type in a name. So let's actually go ahead and let's do that. For the primary final gather file, let's just put simple.fgmap. Now, it's an extensionless file. It can be an extensionless file, or you can add an extension. The extension can be anything you want. In my case, I use fgmap because it makes sense. FG stands for Final Gathering, and it's a map, so fgmap is pretty good. But it can be anything you want. I'll just use fgmap, okay? You notice that it updated and it rendered out. Because I gave it a name, and because rebuild is turned on, it actually wrote the Final Gathering data to a map file. Where is the map file? You can find the map file in the same place where we found the map file for the global illumination photon map in a previous video earlier in this tutorial. So I'll open up a Windows Explorer window here, and I'll go ahead and I'll go to render data, mental ray, and here's my photon maps, shadow maps, light maps, and final Gmap, which stands for Final Gathering Map. If I go in there, here's my simple.fgmap. And right now it's only 767 kilobytes. So it's not very big. It's less than 1 megabyte. Okay? Now the more final gather rays I use, the larger the map's going to be. So right now I'm only using 32. If I increase that to 1024, it's actually going to overwrite the old file. The old file is being overwritten right now by the new file. And the reason it was overwritten is because rebuild is set to on. When it's set to on, what that means is that every time this thing renders, the old map is going to be overwritten by a brand new map, the one that rendered right now. If I go back and look, you notice that with 1024 rays, the size of my final gather map increased to 1.75 megabytes. Okay, so it was less than a megabyte before. Now it's almost 2 megabytes big because just by increasing the number of rays, the accuracy here, which is actually the number of final gathering rays, being computed here by mental ray. Okay, so that's very important to understand. Now, if I go to rebuild and I turn it off, what's going to happen is that the rebuild function is actually still on. It's a little bit confusing at first to wrap your mind around, but just bear with me, it'll make more sense in a moment, okay? When you turn rebuild off, what it basically does, it tells mental array, look, only compute new final gather points and add them to this same final gather map file if there's an update, if something changes. Say, for example, the camera here changes positions and moves around or rotates or something like that. That means that the final gather map is going to add more points. And by adding more of these points, more of these final gathering points, the final gather map is going to become larger and larger and larger. And we'll get to see that in a moment, so don't worry about that too much now. Now, over here we have a freeze option. Freeze is the true option that tells final gathering to turn off. What that means is that every time you render out, the final gather map is not going to be recomputed. It's basically going to read the final gather map that's listed here in the primary final gather file parameter, and it's going to read from that one, and it's not going to create any new final gather points. It's not supposed to when it's set to freeze. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn this on. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and enable the map visualizer over here. The map visualizer can work for final gathering just like it works for global illumination photons. So let's actually turn that on. It's going to render out. Let me actually turn that accuracy back down to 32 so it doesn't take too long to render. Okay, there we go. And if we look here in our scene, let's actually take IPR off. Let's just do a regular render here. Okay, let me close that. Now if you look at our scene, we have all these dots all over the place. What is that? That's the final gathering. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and come in here and I'm going to render out this little area right here. So this is the only area that we're viewing right now in our scene. So you'll notice that all of the other dots disappeared. What happened? Because rebuild is set to on, like I said before, the final gather map is being overwritten. You can think of this as a 3D representation of the actual final gathering map. So you can see how only the areas that were inside our camera view received final gathering points, and areas that were outside of the camera's view didn't. Like let's say this spot right here was outside of view of the camera, so it was completely neglected and didn't get any final gathering points. And you notice that even though final gathering hit the front of this object here, if we look behind it, you notice there's no final gathering at all. The final gathering cannot go through objects, and it won't be calculated for the backside of objects that are not viewable from the camera's perspective. It's very important that you understand that principle of how final gathering works in order to be able to render successfully with final gathering. Okay? Now if I render from back out here, we'll be able to spread a lot of final gather points over the entire scene. Alright? We can see this area is much more detailed because there's a lot of final gathering points gathered in this area right here. But if we render out from, say, out here, I render again and overwrite the old final gather map file. Now you notice if we zoom into that area, there's not a lot of final gather points in this area concentrated right here. There's very few, which is going to give us a poor and inaccurate result. So the more final gather points we have in an area, the better that area is going to look. So that's very important to understand as well. Okay, now let's go ahead and switch from rebuild on to rebuild off. What this means is that now I can do this. Let me actually first switch this back to on. And I'm going to go ahead and render out this area right here. Okay, it's pretty much what we expected. Only the area in the camera view was able to shoot out final gather points and catch these spots here. Everything else in this little city was completely neglected because it was outside of the camera view. Okay, now let me turn rebuild from on to off. And what this basically means, it's going to go ahead and allow final gather points to be added to the map. So if I come over here to this side of the city and I do a render from here, instead of overriding the final gather map, it added to the final gather map. So now you can see, here it is. These new points were added to the old points over here. So technically, you could come in here and you can render out from different angles. Like let's say this angle here, and we just added more final gather points. If we look at this back area, we don't have any final gather points in this area, so let's fill it up with some final gather points. So we'll render out from this view over here. So it's kind of like painting final gather points with a spray paint can that's attached to your camera. And you're trying to fill in and dump a bunch of final gather points all over your scene. Because areas that don't have final gather points will not render out correctly. They're going to have artifacts and they're not going to look good. But areas that do have enough final gather points will look good. So if we come over here and say, oh, there's final gather points here in this area, but this block right here has 0 final gather points. So let's fix that. Let's go ahead and render that out. And now that area has final gathering points. And the back side of that same area doesn't have any final gathering points. So we'll render out from the back side here. And we'll spray some final gathering points in that area. That's how I like to think of it, kind of like spraying with a can of spray paint that's attached to our camera view here. So this area has no final gather points, so we can add more. Now another thing I want you to have a look at is the actual final gather map file. Now it's 13.8 megabytes. It's almost 14 megabytes big. If I go ahead and I add more final gather points from this side here, I'll go ahead and do that. Now there's a lot more final gather points. If I go ahead and look at the map just grew in size. Now it's 16.4. It was 13.8 a moment ago. I added more final gather points and it increased by about 3 megabytes. It went from 13 to 16. Okay? So the more final gather points you add to the scene, the better the scene is going to look for, say, camera animation or an architectural walkthrough of a building or an interior scene. The problem is you're going to need a final gather map that's pretty dense. It's going to need a lot of final gather points for something like that to render out properly. Okay, so that's very important to understand. And this is just by using 32 rays here for the accuracy parameter. If I was using, say, 1,000, this final gather map would be very, very big. And we'd have a very dense looking final gather map in our 3D viewport here with the map visualizer. Okay, and over here we have the freeze option. If we set the freeze option, what it'll do, it'll freeze this current final gather map in place, because that's the one that's loaded here in the primary final gather map file parameter. So what we can do is just, let's do an IPR. We'll render this out. And you notice it didn't do any final gather calculations. It just basically goes straight to rendering out the image. It skips the whole final gather stage because it's just reading off of the current final gather map file, which allows us to render very, very fast. So this is very useful. So the idea, if you're doing, say, camera animation, is to create yourself a final gather map file that's dense enough and has high quality enough to render out this scene. And then what we can do is just take a camera, animate it, and move the camera around, and we can render out quickly a camera animation without having to compute final gathering every single time the camera moves from frame to frame, which would take forever to render out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch from freeze to on. I'm going to go ahead and increase the final gather rays to 1024 so it takes a little bit longer. Now, notice how while it's rendering final gathering, you'll notice that we have these little tiles. And it looks almost like looking through a piece of glass that has water rolling down the glass. You can see it looks like sort of we're looking through this glass that's refracting light. And then when it finishes, it renders out the final image. What is that? That's the final gather preview. If we turn the preview final gather tiles off, you'll notice that we don't see anything happen. That's because it's computing final gathering right now. But you can't tell because it's not showing you the preview tiles like before. Okay, so the preview tiles are actually pretty useful. Now let me show you here by doing an actual render. If you notice on the bottom left of the interface, we get this progress bar that says Mental Ray Computing Final Gather Points. When we turn the Preview Final Gather Tiles option off over here in the render settings, we don't get to see a preview of the Final Gather tiles. It basically just stays blank, and it won't actually show us anything until it finishes computing the final gathering and starts rendering out the actual image. Which could be a good thing or bad thing. If you don't like to see those tiles, you can turn it off. If you do, you can turn it on. I like to have it on because it allows me to see what in the world is going on. you can quickly and easily see if the lighting looks right. If the lighting was too bright, you'd be able to tell in this preview, and then you could cancel out the render by hitting escape on the keyboard instead of sitting there wasting time, and then at the end when it renders out, maybe you don't like it and you have to go ahead and do another render again. So it's a good time saver. I like to use the preview mode here and keep it on. Okay, so I'm going to hit escape to cancel this render out, and I'm also going to go ahead and knock this back down to 32 rays. And then down here we have the diagnose final gather, and I know I skipped this option here that says pre-compute photon lookup, which is grayed out right now. We'll talk about that in a moment. The diagnose final gathering, what this does, man, let me just actually show you. We'll turn it on, we'll render out. This is what we get. We can actually see the final gather points. It's the same thing as using the map visualizer, only instead of using it in the 3D viewport here in Maya, we can actually view it in the render here. So we can actually see what in the world's going on. So, for example, let's come up here, let's go to Window, let's go to Rendering Editors, let's go to Mental Ray, and let's go to Map Visualizer, and we'll hit Delete to get rid of that. We'll come in here, and we'll render out from here. So let's just do a quick render right here from up close. There's our final gather points. I'm going to go ahead and turn this to freeze. I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to render again. And we'll notice that there's the final gather points. It's working exactly like the map visualizer. And we can see these areas over here are dark and there's strange artifacting going on. That's because final gather rays are not reaching those areas. And using the diagnose final gathering, it's the same thing as working with the map visualizer, only instead of working the 3D viewport, you can see these green dots here inside of the render view window when you render out. So I can switch this to off, that way I can add more final gather points to the map, render out from here, and it went ahead and added all those extra final gather points to the ones that were already here, right there in the scene. Let me turn off enable map visualizer for the moment, and let me actually go back to Window, Rendering Editors, Mental Ray, Map Visualizer, hit delete again. Okay, let me close that. I'm going to turn diagnose final gathering off. Now you notice that there's this other option here that I kind of skipped over called secondary final gather file. This is a new option now in Mental Ray for Maya 2009, and it's a pretty neat option. What it allows us to do, it allows us to create multiple final gather map files and actually combine them. Let me show you how that works. Let me turn rebuild back to on, and I'm going to create a new final gather map. I'm going to rename this from simple to, let me just call it number 1. So this will be final gather map number 1. Now I'm going to render out this final gather map from this part of the city right here. Okay, so let's render this out here. So now I have final gather points that cover this area here and no other part of the city. Let me close that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another final gather map. I'm going to come in here and change this from number 1 to number 2. And this is a new final gather map file, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to render it from this area over here. So let's go ahead and do a render from there. Okay, so there it is. So now we got final gather points in these areas over here. Let me close that. Now let me retype number 1 over here. Okay, and I'm going to go to rebuild and I'm going to turn it to freeze so it no longer adjusts or edits my final gather maps. Okay, and if I render from this side, it's not going to look very good. Looks very nasty. As you can see, there's huge artifacts going on here. That's because right now it's reading the number 1 final gather map, which was rendered out for this view over here. If I render out from this view, you'll notice that it looks pretty good. Right here, this area looks good. That back area over here though, right here in this area, didn't look too great. Now if I switch it to final gather map number 2, and I render that, it looks pretty good. No artifacting. But now if I go back and I render this area out, it's not going to look very good. As you can see, there's some problems here. The final gathering just is not working properly. Okay, so how can we solve this problem? Well, here's one thing we can do. Let's make the primary final gather map file map number 1. And then down here we'll click on add new item. And for the final gather merge file, we'll go ahead and we'll put in map number 2. So map number 2 is, if I go over here to my file browser, this is map number 2. So I'll copy the name and I'll type it in this field here. Okay, hit enter, there it is. Alright, so now if I render out from this side, it looks pretty good because it's using map number 1. But now if I render back from this side and I render again, you'll notice that it still looks pretty good. That's because it's merging the final gather points from map 2 with map 1. So it's using this as the primary final gather map file, but it's taking this secondary final gather map, which is why it's called the secondary final gather file, and it's actually taking those points and going, let me combine those with map number 1. That way we have a more complete final gather map, and now areas like this back area here will render out correctly. And this is a great way of merging final gather maps, 2 different final gather maps, say for an architectural visualization or an animation, where you're going to be moving the camera around different rooms and different areas behind different objects. You can actually render out a couple of final gather map passes, and then you can combine the 2 together using this new secondary final gather file map option. So it's extremely useful. If you want to get rid of it, you can just hit this little trash can icon right here, and you're back to square one. And if we render this out again, you notice that the back area no longer renders correctly, because now we're using the final gather solution from this final gather map file here, number 1. Okay, so we covered all these settings here for final gathering. The only one that I skipped over was this pre-compute photon lookup option. You notice it's grayed out. I can't do anything with it. The reason is because that option works with global illumination. You can actually combine global illumination and final gathering to render out even nicer. And that's where this option comes into play. But we're not going to look at that now. We're going to finish this video here. In the next video, we're going to look at other things in Mental Ray. And then later on, we're going to jump into another chapter where we're going to go back to global illumination and we're going to combine it with final gathering to create ourselves a very nice optimized render that's going to look great and render out at a pretty decent speed. So I'm going to end this video here, and I'll see you in the next chapter.